Welcome to You Decide. I'm your host, Errol Lewis. We are quickly approaching the June 24th Democratic primary for mayor of New York City, and the pace is picking up. The polls have consistently shown one candidate, Andrew Cuomo, with a clear lead, usually getting a little bit more than a third of the vote, but he's still supported by less than a majority of voters. Undecided seems to be doing pretty well with about 22%, and everybody else, it's about 8 candidates at this point, are trying to get on the radar screen. They're trying to get your attention, they're trying to get donations, and they're trying to get elected. One of those candidates is Michael Blake. He's a native New Yorker raised in the Bronx. He has held positions at the federal, state, and local levels, and he highlights that experience as a major selling point in his bid for mayor. Blake worked as an aide for the Obama White House and represented parts of the Bronx in the state assembly for 6 years. He says he wants to make universal childcare a reality and create incentives to keep local businesses from moving out of the city. Coming up is my conversation with Michael Blake. Michael Blake, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Always, brother.
All right.
Appreciate you.
Why running? Why now? What's this all about?
I really believe that I have the best and most unique vision on how we can actually help people make and keep more money and actually address affordability in the city in the environment that we're in of Trump. I intentionally, Errol, launched the campaign November 26 last year, 1126. I wanted to signify who do you think is best prepared on January 1st, 2026 to lead the city, given everything that's been happening. And there's 2 things that I can say that no one else can say. I'm the only person that has been a part of a team that has actually defeated Donald Trump when I was vice chair of the DNC. And I'm the only person who has White House, State House, and local experience. And so to the question of why am I running and why now? Because you need a mayor who's a manager with empathy that can actually lead the city, given what is happening in D.C.
The bio says that you are the founder and CEO of Kairos Democracy Project. Tell us what that is.
Kairos is the other definition of time. It means opportunities to create moments. And our whole vision is to be the approach around the storytelling of democracy, because too often I feel that we are not communicating well the issues. And quite frankly, it's the reason why Democrats lost twice to Trump, because he was able to articulate a vision, even though the policies didn't connect with that. Mm-hmm. And too often we're not being addressing on that. So we mobilize content creators, influencers, storytelling, digital mobilization to be creative and not just go to people in traditional ways. Errol, most people don't realize that last year, of the 100 highest viewed shows on TV the entire year, 93 were NFL football games. It's not coincidental why Trump would go to UFC fights, go to football games, college football as well. And so if we're serious about how we want to connect with people, Kairos Democracy Project was the entity to have a better communication outlet to mobilize people for real impact.
Oh, I was looking at the website, and the 2 things stood out for me. One is that I didn't know a lot of the people, and I take that as a good sign, right? That if you're talking about influencers and other people, I'm like, okay, good, you young people, good luck.
I have gray hair, so I still consider my young.
and then I saw that it's a 501c4, which for those who don't know, it's a charity, but it can legally get involved in partisan political campaigns of one kind or another, mostly issue campaigns, I take it?
Primarily issue campaigns, because you want to be able to articulate specific to that issue, whether it be what's happening on housing, what's happening on immigration, what's happening on education itself. We did have involvement at the end of the 2024 cycle because we wanted to get more people from New York to go do organizing in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. But yes, you have to find more ways to mobilize people, because the reality is if they see Democrat or Republican, people will withdraw. We want to have entities like the Kairos Democracy Project to pull people in, especially, Errol, around gaming. That's a heavy focus of what's happening right now. Trump and his team were utilizing chats exceptionally well to feed Republican messaging. We have to get better about having gaming and influencers in that realm, as well as how are you utilizing DJs and entertainers and athletes.
When you say gaming, you're talking about like poker and stuff?
Video gaming.
Oh, video games.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point.
Not
like poker or blackjack.
We've got a whole casino, sweepstakes going on where they're trying to, get everybody hooked on gambling in New York.
I'm talking about the cats that are sitting and actually playing video games and are having information fed into their chats.
Let me ask you about. Let me push back on that a little bit. If people are sitting around watching football or people are playing video games, So what? Right? I mean, I think it's always been that way, right? I bet in the ancient Roman Colosseum there were people who wanted to go see people get mauled to death by bears, and then there were people who actually cared about running the republic. You don't have to chase after people necessarily to that extent, do you?
No, I think you got to go where people are at, and at the end of the day,
but do you though?
You do.
I mean, but you wouldn't, well, maybe you would, but you wouldn't, for example, go to a nightclub, right, where people are there to get drunk and, meet a future spouse, right? I mean, and talk there about democracy or city policy or why they should register to vote. That just wouldn't be a good use of anybody's time.
I push back on that because we're continuing to operate in the mode of only going in specific manners, as if they're not voters in these places. People are going to concerts. People like to be entertained. I think about when I was an aide to President Obama, we had an event in D.C. where will.i.am and Black Eyed Peas freestyled off of people texting onto the screen. They showed up to a concert, it became a mobilization. Right? And so whether it be the nightclub, which we can see your dance moves, we can challenge you, see what's going on out here, right? Whether it be the concert, whether it be the game, we have to go where people are at. Because right now, especially because what's happening in DC, people are turning off their TVs. They're like, I only want to engage with streaming. I only want to be entertained. I only want to be in my comfort zone. As a New Yorker, most people are like, you know what? I don't want to see anything about the news, but if you want to talk to me about the Knicks or the Yankees or the Mets, now let's rock. So why would we not be in those spaces to be able to actually talk about issues and then let someone make their own decisions?
Okay, interesting. All of the candidates for mayor have said in one way or another, the Democratic candidates, that the cost of living is the #1 issue in the campaign. What is your take on that and your proposed solution?
Absolutely. I think that there are very specific things we have to do. First, we have to have a local median income because area median income is not working. It doesn't make sense that you have Westchester County and other places outside the city that are determining what's happening with our affordability. You then have to take a step of determining if you're providing city contracts out, which you have to because of the services that are being deployed, the expectation of higher wages for the people that are being employed and subcontracted for that work. That is a way you can ensure that dual benefit. Then guaranteed income. I was the first person in the race talking about it. I know, there's another candidate now talking about it. I'm being very specific that if we implement the true cost of living, which New Yorkers voted on, people forget that, to understand what are your collective expenses.
Meaning, right, we're supposed to, according to the city charter, calculate something called the true cost of living.
Absolutely, right? Because now you're effectively looking at poverty metrics by itself, but you're not assessing childcare, groceries, et cetera. If we did that, then I do believe we should be looking at considering whether it be reserves or other revenue streams, helping New Yorkers hit that threshold of what would be the guaranteed income you need to be at proportional to your cost of living. Those are practical steps. Now, next step, how do we change what's happening around housing? Housing and childcare are the two fundamental expenses when it comes to our affordability. We should eliminate credit scores being used for rent homeownership applications. It is a discriminatory practice. It is not a true articulation of how someone actually is going to pay their bills. If someone missed a phone bill 10 years ago, but they paid their rent 10 years in a row, that's the clear barometer of what makes sense. We also, Errol, have to increase and expand income thresholds for housing applications because you effectively have to be rich or poor enough to get access to many homes in New York. You are effectively penalizing people to do better and well in New York City because if they make too much, then they come off these subsidies, which is wrong and not acceptable. Lastly, childcare. There has to be an approach around universal childcare, which again, we can pay for these elements. So to your question, that is how I would actually be intentional around how we do this. Then the question is, which I have not heard anyone else articulating as directly as I am, how do you pay for this? It's nice to have great ideas, but how do you pay for this? First, you have $2 billion of unclaimed fines and fees in New York City, primarily from parking tickets. Let's pursue that. Second, we need to have a vacant apartment tax, which if you do that for someone that is not utilizing New York as a primary residence, that can generate $400 million by itself. Third, we have to be much more intentional of how are we better managing what's happening within the city budget. In particular, NYPD has $1.4 billion in overtime that clearly was not connected to public safety. And then fourth and finally, I do think we have to take the serious step that when, not if, Trump and Elon and others cut funds to New York, how do you work with employers to withhold sending those taxes back to D.C.? Those are steps that can be taken to make sure you're able to pay for these kinds of programs.
Okay, that's a lot. That's a mouthful there. I want to ask you about a couple of points within that, though. I guess starting with the last point, you're recommending that businesses withhold taxes from the federal government as a response, to overreach by the administration?
Absolutely,
Is that the idea?
absolutely. Because if we look,
It doesn't sound quite legal.
it absolutely is legal. Because at the end of the day, if we're in a scenario where you are having funds cut off for unconstitutional purposes,
right?
Because that is where we're at right now. We're in a scenario where Trump and their team are saying, you will take this action, recognizing there's no legal standing for that. Why would you force someone to then respond back at retaliation for a negative damage? It doesn't make sense to us. And when we think about with the consideration, why are we all in this scenario of actually running for mayor? Because we have a mayor who was pursuing unconstitutional actions by listening to Donald Trump. And so when we think about those steps, we don't want to have to go down that road. But we do have to be intentional of how are we funding these programs? And I think that has to be one of the elements on the table. But starting first, we do know there are things that we can do and I can do, Michael Blake as mayor, regardless what's happening in D.C., because we have to presume those cuts are coming to address this.
One thing that I imagine would happen, if you try and chase down all of these fees and fines, you're going to find a lot of people who are either bankrupt or missing or just flat broke and are never going to give you that, whatever it is, couple of $1 billion.
Well, we've seen it's been the opposite when you do it with humanity. There's an entity called Promise Pay that has been doing this work with cities across the country. A lot of times it has been the fear of retaliation of the individual who has not paid that ticket. And in particular when it comes to parking, right? If you haven't paid a parking ticket, more times than not, it's likely that it's not that you don't have it. You might have forgotten about it, might have moved on from it, and you may be afraid that, okay, someone's gonna come for me. But if you have the conversation, hey, just reaching out, we're holding everybody accountable, like as we would all the time, right? And equally, if there's a scenario because of the cost of living that people are going through, and you need a timetable for payment, let's work that all through. Again, we're seeing other cities do this. It's not that we cannot do it. And if we're not pursuing that, then we're talking about leaving money on the table that we need.
Okay, no, that sounds interesting. When you talk about unnecessary overtime and maybe repurposing some of that money, that sounds perilously close to defunding the NYPD, which is, as a slogan, has been politically very effective against Democrats.
Yeah, no, so not at all. Let's be clear. There's a big difference in which when something happens, more times than not, if there's an emergency, your first call, if it was to me, be to my wife and then probably to mama, right? Next call is probably 911 if something's jumping off, right? So I tell people, be intentional of the purpose of the words. I am not of the mindset that you're eliminating the police department, full stop. That's just nonsensical, that's not realistic. The framing of defund the police, which it's been fascinating because Andrew Cuomo is now saying those are the three dumbest words, but he was the same one before saying that we need to do this, right? Was about how are you repurposing how some of the funds are happening within NYPD. Whether it be Strategic Resource Group, which is an entity that's pretty much only used when there's significant unrest or perceived unrest. We shouldn't be having NYPD going onto college campuses in the ways they have been. But very specifically to the question, when you have $1.4 billion of spent in overtime, in large part because of having a reduced police force, but people saying they're walking away because they want to see changes happening with criminal justice, and or, again, let's call it what it is. There was a sex scandal for promotions that was happening that led to that $1.4 billion. That had nothing to do about public safety, right? That was incompetence, inefficiency, and mismanagement. And so if I were to say to any manager, did you have a good reason why $1.4 billion was spent in overtime and there was not a improvement in your metrics? You would tell that manager, you need to fix this, right? And so from any standpoint, we're saying very clearly, we have to be serious about what's happening throughout the budget. But at the same time, I do believe there are tactical things we can do to improve our public safety. For example, we should not have officers be the first responders when it comes to mental health concerns. Mental health professionals, overdose prevention centers, opioid settlement funds, utilize those steps, involuntary confinement for the person that's in need. Finding more ways that you have an officer that's doing foot patrol with body cameras on. You take those kinds of steps and then have changes in Albany from discovery, speedy trial, et cetera, so that repeat offenders in highly concentrated neighborhoods are being held accountable. You take those steps, you're going to make it more likely that more officers will come back onto the force, and then you're not spending that money in overtime as we're currently doing.
And then I guess finally, let me ask you about within your affordability framework. When it comes to housing, you may even have sat through these kinds of meetings. What you're talking about is extending some of the subsidies that go into housing, if you're going to build any kind of affordable housing in New York, to middle class New Yorkers, to working New Yorkers. So you can easily get up into the range where people are making $80,000, $90,000, $120,000 in a household, and they still need help. I understand that. You understand that. Try selling that at a meeting where people are saying only the poorest of the poor should get all of the housing. Why are you trying to subsidize the rich and gentrify this neighborhood?
And because we have allowed, and this actually goes back to the early point about Kairos Democracy Project, right? We have allowed messaging to confuse us from the facts. Poor is something that someone feels that's not connected to a number, right? Poverty is that metric. And what is happening right now is that you have individuals that are effectively just poor enough, being seen as low income, getting all the access. But we think about it. I was the chair of the Mitchell-Lama subcommittee that was focused on working class, middle class housing. Mm-hmm. Why would we have a scenario where someone has to work 2, sometimes 3 jobs to hopefully be able to get access to a home? It's wrong. And a lot of this is because of bad policy. And so when we think through how do we help everyone to win, I have said in our Welcome Home plan, when you go to blakefornyc.com, go to Welcome Home, you see our affordable housing plan. We've had a metric of 600,000 being the units that we believe we have to get to that would help us get back to the number, especially of New Yorkers, and particularly Black New Yorkers and other New Yorkers who moved to the South, who felt it was simply not affordable to be here. You have to build more housing. Anyone saying otherwise is not being realistic. But you have to ensure that you're building to the middle and working class, which goes back to implementing the true cost of living. Mm-hmm. Because if we're continuing to be in a scenario where you're only subsidizing low income for whatever that means term for that area, you're effectively blocking out the majority that is actually there. And so that's what's going to lead to gentrification and displacement, mm-hmm. because mm-hmm. you're in a scenario where the people who want to stay in these neighborhoods can't, because the policy and the thresholds are not making sense. And so that's why I say not only do you have to build more, you also have to ensure that the incentives being provided to these developers and landlords, if they are not hitting these metrics, they should have the incentives taken away.
I made a mini campaign some years ago through my column suggesting that people call it workforce housing. Stop calling it low-income housing. Call it workforce.
It would change the game and
has
change
a different feel.
Absolutely.
And sort of gets closer to what it is we want as the ultimate outcome.
Totally.
Let me ask you about some things. I noticed this. I'm watching some of the campaign stuff. When did you get married? I'm like, when did Michael Blake get married?
Last year, 2024.
Yeah.
August 3rd. A brilliant, amazing Black woman, Brooke, who is fantastic, half Jamaican, half Honduran. I became a bonus dad at the same time. I'm smiling as I'm saying this right now. I became a bonus dad at the same time. So we have a 16-year-old who plays volleyball, 13-year-old who plays basketball. I've become that girl dad that is always wondering what's going on. It's amazing when I get excited talking about it. So Brooke played tennis. She was Michigan State. I'm a Northwestern guy, so we have Big Ten battles all the time. Amalia does volleyball. Elsie does basketball. So having 3 other sports fanatics around is amazing and a blessing. And she's a woman of God. And very briefly, this is how you know God is always present in control. We met at a conference that I was at. I was at a conference in Atlanta, which typically there would be no reason for me to be at that type of conference. Mm-hmm. I was there for marketing and other purposes. And she was about to speak. And I see a pastor walk up who I've preached for before, Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley, who was a titan in the civil rights movement. And I'm talking. And I said, Durley, why are you at a law conference? And he said, because my niece is about to speak. I was like, who's your niece? And I turned, and then she walks over. She's like, well, how do y'all know each other? He's like, oh, Michael has preached for me. I was in right there.
Bro code. I see you. In fact, actually, that was the related question. When did you become a minister?
So I've been a minister. Fortunately, I've become a reverend now. So I was a minister since 1995. So I am the epitome of a Jamaican, right? Because the tree jobs. So my mom always teased me, Michael Alexander Blake. My mama always said I was going to be a preacher, a journalist, or a politician. I became all 3, actually, right? So in 1995, I became a certified lay speaker in the United Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. Shout out to Calvary United Methodist Church in the Bronx. But then when I moved to Michigan and D.C. for Obama time, because I was with President started with him in '06 and '07. Then after, the AME church is what pulled me in. So I became an exhorter in the AME church. I was at Trinity AME in Michigan and the Al Chapel AME in DC. And then when I came back home full time, the Union Grove Missionary Baptist Church, Reverend Frederick Crawford, who's been a blessing, pulled me in and was like, okay, so you're doing all this other places. What are we doing here, right? And I had been, I had been running from it for a while because I was reluctant only because I thought people would treat me differently by hearing Rev, right? It was not that I didn't feel it. I mean, I preached all the time. I love you see me, but no, this is who I've been, and that's my spirit. I'm born on Christmas Day. Like it literally is like what are we doing, right? And then you get to the point where I was not going to fight the calling that God had for me. At one, two, I also wondered, would people see you differently as a public servant? And then I had to remind myself.
Well, hopefully they would, right? I mean,
they look at you differently with a higher threshold. And we have a track record, right? You had, obviously Congressman Flake in Queens. Obviously, I mean, Adam Clayton Powell being the epitome in Harlem. Senator Warnock, who, even though he's in Atlanta, folks forget, he was a preacher in New York itself.
He was a youth minister at Abyssinia. When I got baptized there, when he was there, right? There,
so I was like, you know what? This is a way to epitomize what we're taught about in Matthew 25, serve the least of these. So it has been a blessing on top of all that is happening to have both happen in my life.
Okay, so you got your ticket punch, you're ordained and everything.
That's right, that's true.
All right.
And I passed my ordination exam last year on the day of what would have been my daddy's 90th birthday.
How about that?
That was nothing but God.
Okay. So now, is your plan to become and remain affiliated with the church, regardless of the outcome of this election?
Absolutely. Union Grove Missionary Baptist Church is our foundation. That's our rock. I do think the fact that people have seen me across the city, it is the reason why we have the second most clergy endorsements of anyone in the race. Sometimes it has been fascinating to me. The conversation of the campaign has effectively been about just two candidates, and people are not seeing how others are building organization. I would say in a race like this, especially when you want to mobilize Black and brown folk, having places of worship is a foundation that is something I'm very confident about because that is a network that is repeatedly telling people, this is our guy. Every single week, this is our guy. This is our guy. That's not going to pop in a poll. That's not going to pop in a news story every single time. But
Well, you're totally right about that. I mean, there are a lot of journalists who, they'll just kind of record the fact that candidate X visited a church or a number of churches. And it's kind of like, well, it looks a little different if you're actually sitting in the church, right? I mean, because lots of people will come and visit. All are welcome. That's kind of the basic, that's the whole point. But there are people who, get a different kind of reception and are going to get a different kind of response from the congregation.
A perfect example of that, Errol, is just recently I spoke at First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem. I've known Pastor Mike for years, right? And then because I'm also AME licensed, later that day, the New York Annual Conference had an AME conference happen at Greater Allen. And so I'm getting acknowledged as mayoral candidate, but I'm also a
mega
reverend.
Church in Southeast Queens. So those who don't know.
You're able to be in spaces with legitimate credibility. It's like Michael's not just here because he's a mayoral candidate.
Right.
Michael has literally been preaching for, mercy, I just thought about it, 30 years. So when you're in that zone, it's like, this is not some hypothetical thing of who he is. We know him.
Sure. Quotes the Bible without having to hold it in his hand. Tell me where you grew up and how did your parents end up there?
Crescent and Burnside. I'm a Bronx boy through and through. Looking down because I'm internalizing my dad's recent birthday just passed because of the date, so internalizing all that there. My family's from Jamaica. I was one of two that was born here. My mom, who is the epitome of the matriarch, everything about the immigrant experience, right? Mama grew up in Alexandria, Jamaica, St. Anne's Bay. Daddy grew up in Papine. In St. Andrew near Kingston. Mama was homeless in Jamaica. So when her mom, my maternal grandma, passed away, Mama was 3. And the family didn't take her in. My mom slept on church pews in Jamaica, right? My mom was a teen mom and came to the States, raised 4 boys, tells us often the story of how she had to pass a sewing exam to make sure she was able to get her citizenship. My mom, this is probably one of the reasons why my mom and Brooke love each other so much, because my mom, she raised 4 boys. So my mom's a sports fanatic like us, right? And she would talk about how when she came here that first day, there was this guy named Pops. That was just his nickname. And it was watching baseball. Like she immediately, which obviously because of Jamaica, we have cricket. So there's that connection there, right? And that's Mama. Daddy, God rest his soul, he passed in 2013. He was a janitor at St. Barnabas Hospital in the Bronx, an 1199 SEIU man. Shout out to all my labor families out here. Mama worked at a manufacturing plant in Jersey. She took 2 buses to get to work every day. And going back to the earlier part of the conversation, they actually met at a party. They actually met at a party, right?
There you go.
And stayed active and engaged at my church. Calvin and I met this church. My dad became the first Black person that a stained glass window was named in his honor. So my daddy drove the church van. My mama led the youth group. My godparents led communion. And I was the president of the youth. Like, it was like literally we were everything there. And they did everything. You know, my mom has retired and has done the work, right? She raised a retired sergeant first class in the Army. She raised a young man who was a DJ. She raised another one who was a welder. My second oldest brother, he passed away about almost 3 years ago. And then she raised a young boy who worked for a president in the White House. Like, Mama did good, right?
Oh, yeah.
And will still text me at the middle of the night, did you see what the Yankees just did? Right? like, can you believe what is going on right now? Yo? But that's fam. And you know,
what needs to be done to keep the promise of New York alive for future immigrants and migrants?
Well, very directly, we shouldn't have ICE at our schools, our places of worship, our community centers, because it's unconstitutional and it's wrong. We have to expand the conversation of immigration, because we have allowed MAGA Republicans, I want to be very specific because it's not the entire Republican Party, but we've allowed MAGA Republicans to make immigration a Latino-only conversation. It is Latino, it is Caribbean, it is African, it is Asian, it is all of us who are intertwined in this. We've allowed that coalition, that small minority, to make it an us-them conversation, which I do remind people, going back to faith, that Jesus was a Jewish man of color who was a refugee in a foreign land. So like, it's fascinating when I hear people talk to me about we don't like immigrants, but they call themselves Christians. Like, you can't actually have both, right? It doesn't really work that way. And so to that degree, we got to change the narrative. Then we got to change the policies. And then we have to be very intentional on how we are protecting one another. And this is one of the reasons why I decided to run for mayor. We will have a scenario from 2026 to 2030 where, at least for 2 years, we're going to be wondering and assessing, how are we protecting the most vulnerable when you have a sexist, racist demagogue doing everything humanly possible to try to harm our communities. And when that happens, usually it leads to cut of funding and programs to people that look like you and I, for folks that are not having the access they need. And we're watching right now, Errol. We're watching families that are concerned about walking their kids to school because will ICE roll up on them. We're watching right now of students who are genuinely wondering, can I protest? Can I speak my mind? Because I'm afraid that ICE is going to pull up on me. And so to that degree, you have to have the intentionality of how are we having our legal protections for our immigrants and families, because as we're seeing right now, they're going after citizens. It's not just those that are supposedly undocumented, right? But then it's also about how do we have a very thoughtful approach in all that we're doing, including language access. We can't just have things just in English. And one thing that is never really fully addressed, you have about 180,000 immigrants, in particular African immigrants, who we've seen a lot, who do not have legal representation when they're going into these hearings.
Sure.
So you're creating a cycle of violence and disruption. We talk that through. We also then, to the broader question, it goes back to how we envision management. When you're not reimbursing nonprofits on time, we see that you have childcare centers, such as in Brooklyn, with Grant Street and others, Nuestros Niños, that are taking care of immigrant families, worked and led by immigrant communities, who are now wondering, are we going to have funds? And we're now wondering if people are going to get deported. Like, it's a cycle that's not helpful.
Yeah. That is an issue that has been bugging me for a while. I've been asking a lot of the candidates about it. To the extent that that is a management failure, and it clearly is, but it's kind of a multi-generational one. I mean, I remember talking about this with candidates in like the 2009 race. We talked about it in the 2005 race. Nonprofits have been getting, who contract with the city, have been getting screwed, for lack of a better word.
1,000%.
They do the work. They're not quite compensated enough. Even when they get it, it might be a year late. It might be 2 years late. They have to lay off staff. They have to close their doors. The service suffers. It's just a complete catastrophe. But we've institutionalized it. What will you do different? And actually, I have to say, Mayor Adams showed some signs of, I mean, every time you bring it up, anybody who knows New York City government says, yeah, that's true. I'm going to do something about that, right? Both controller candidates, I mean, everybody knows. Everybody knows it. Everybody says they're going to change it. Nobody gets it done. How will you be different?
First, we have to declare an emergency around nonprofit reimbursement rates, where it shouldn't just be reimbursement, it should be grants. Because there's a difference. Now, this is one of those levels of experience of being a small business owner, and also because of the C4, I've seen it on both sides. It's not a scenario, Errol, where we don't have the funds. That's the wild part.
Right.
The money's there.
No, that's right.
Right.
And nobody benefits from delaying it, and yet it's always delayed.
I mean, look, if we want to have the real conversation, let's do it on your podcast. There are some folks who benefit from it. There are people that delays in the system validate their jobs in government. Because you're effectively telling people, you've won the contract, so I already know the funds are here.
Right.
I'm not giving you your pay because you didn't fill out paperwork correctly, you didn't submit it in the passport system. These are nonsensical things. So when you ask about now it's a very different thing. I always try to make it related to the people on the block. It's a different thing if someone was like, you know what, we have these different expenses and my contracts got cut off and I just don't got it. Right? That's a totally different conversation.
Right.
I need more time before we could pay this. You're talking about a government of $114 billion that has the money. So that's not the issue there. So specifically, what can you do? First, I have said within the first 100 days that I would declare an emergency around the true cost of living and affordability, and included within that, unless there is a legal justification otherwise, contracts that are outstanding to the nonprofits who have done the work already would be paid within that 100 days.
Okay, good.
And I have repeatedly asked this of others in the race, including the current and former comptroller, including the current speaker. You all literally have the power to move this.
Clear up the backlog. I got it.
There's not a good reason there.
Yeah.
And to your earlier question, if you do that, you substantially address the cost of living crisis, because you have families who are literally waiting months, if not years, for payments where they know the money's already there.
Right. When you talk about the true cost of living and making sure that people have sort of a basic wage or basic income, should City Hall be involved in redistribution to that extent?
Absolutely. And I want to give a shout out to Jennifer Jones-Austin for her leadership on focusing on the true cost of living, which again, remind New Yorkers, we voted for this. This passed.
Well, no. It's one thing to promulgate the standard, right? I mean, it'll be a different measure. Okay, fine. So then what do we do with that measure? And it sounded, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounded like what you were saying earlier is you would basically write checks out of the Treasury to families to bring them up to that level.
We need to. And we know it's there's legal precedence to do this. We're seeing other places examine it. There's a reason why you have a mayor's for guaranteed income across the city, which again is different from universal basic income. I want to be very clear about the distinction, because I am not saying that you're just giving a blanket check to everybody, right?
I get it. Which politically would actually be easier than what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I'm actually saying let's be very targeted on how we approach this. And so we see this in Stockton, California. We're seeing this in St. Louis, what they did with baby bonds. We're seeing it. The state of Connecticut is going through a similar model as well for baby bonds, where we're demonstrating how you can actually get funds out. Equally, Errol, we've taken off the table that we can't do this, because during COVID, checks went out to people.
Sure.
So it's not a scenario of we can't figure this out. And it's not a scenario where we're like, well, we've bankrupted the system. Those two things didn't happen. So now it is a scenario where we're just not doing this.
Right.
Then people will say, and again, I do think elections about choice and contrast. Michael Blake, this sounds like this would be expensive. Well, here's the reality. You have $3.1 billion in reserves, not talking about pensions, right? If we help people pay their bills and be able to spend money now, you're spending less on them being dependent on government services. You're actually going to make more money for the city doing it this way. And if I reduce the likelihood of people becoming homeless, where we think about 1 out of 8 kids being homeless in New York City schools, we will actually then improve our financial conditions. There is a common sense approach around this. It takes the will to be saying we're going to actually implement this, because, tying this together, I think folks are allowing the fear of equity because they internalize that. They think a voter will say, that means you're just going to be helping a bunch of poor and black and brown people, as opposed to equity, the economic condition. My job as mayor is to help you. It's the reason why I was elected 3 times in the assembly. It's the reason why I was elected a vice chair of DNC, because we talk about economic conditions. And the reason why Donald Trump won twice and Joe Biden won once is they focus on the economic agenda.
Okay. No, I got it. We are going to wish you the best of luck. I know this is, well, it's funny. You spend a lot of time for a minister. You spend a lot of time around sinners, which I guess technically is technically you're supposed to.
What is that?
I'm thinking the DNC. I'm thinking the clubhouses of New York City that you're visiting.
You just called the DNC sinners? Is that what you said?
I'm thinking about 6.
Errol Lewis just said that. I just want to make sure he said that.
6 years in Albany.
Wait, Errol, did you just call legislators? Yo, you are wilding.
Well, let's put it this way. Well, actually, let me put it in a normal frame.
Oh my goodness.
Character, honesty, and integrity actually count. Almost nobody talks about it. We all know it's super important, and I think more so than ever, I think we've seen what happens when you try and defer that question. Sure. Apply that to this race.
You need to see very clearly that a budget is a moral document, and you're going to be in a scenario at a minimum, again, from 2026 through 2029. You're going to see obscene continual cuts to communities already hurting. I think my morality as a reverend is actually going to help me be better in leading a city in that kind of environment and not get caught up in the foolishness. And then equally, and again, we talk about this on our website, blakefornyc.com. We talk about this a lot. The topic that gets discussed the most in the Bible is actually poverty. People never think about that. The topic that is discussed the most throughout the Bible, poverty. When Jesus asked and said, this is what you did for me, now how did you do it? You fed me when I was hungry. You clothed me when I was naked. You took care of. That is who we are as a people, whether it be in the Old Testament for our Jewish brothers and sisters, whether it be at a shul, whether it be if I'm at a masjid with my Muslim brothers and sisters, whether it be for our Christians. Poverty and economic conditions is at the root of who we are. Lastly, it may seem like it's a distinct, but you got me connected here. If Pontius Pilate would not have listened to the crowds, Jesus would have still been alive. Pontius Pilate did not want to send Jesus to crucifixion. He was trying to find every possible reason not to.
Sure.
The crowds kept saying to do this. So when you ask me how this drives me, I want people in New York City to know that you can have someone in Michael Blake who's a son of immigrants, who's a child of God, who is here for you because my faith has grounded who I am and what kind of elected I will be.
Okay. Best of luck. We'll see you out on the campaign trail.
Appreciate you. Always.
All right. Do you want more conversations with the people who are shaping the future of New York City and beyond? Check out our New York One podcast channel in the description. And hit subscribe to let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, elections, and issues.